Welcome everyone to today's webinar on genetic counseling and testing. I am very excited about this webinar today because the International Alliance believes strongly in the fundamental right of people living with ALS to genetic counseling and testing. For this webinar today, we have both English and Spanish captions available. If you're joining us live on Zoom, we will put the instructions in the chat box for the Zoom participants. If you're watching the recording later in time, you'll find the instructions on how to use the captioning in both English and Spanish in the video description, and it will instruct you how to activate the subtitles. So if you're joining us today, we will post these periodically in the chat because latecomers to the chat only see what was posted after they join in the Zoom. If you have questions today, please write them in the Zoom question and answer box. And if you're watching from Facebook, you can add your questions in the comments. Those questions will be passed on to myself as the moderator, and I will ask those questions of the panel. There is a lot to cover today, and we did have a lot of pre-submitted questions. So hopefully we'll get to as many as we can and answer as many questions as we can on today's topic in the time that we have. We really want to thank our sponsor Biogen, without whom this webinar series would not be possible. And we're very grateful to them for supporting our webinar series. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Catherine Cummings, and I'm your moderator for today. My normal role is as Executive Director of the International Alliance of ALS MND Association. And today I'm joined by an incredible panel. And as I said earlier, at the top of the webinar, the importance of genetic counseling and testing can't be emphasized enough. Today, we're going to look at some real life situations. We have a couple of people on our panel who have their own scenarios that they're going to tell us about and ask questions that are very real for them and for others in our community. Questions will be asked on family history, research, access, genetic discrimination, and mental health. And I just want to emphasize again that the International Alliance of ALS MND Associations really supports the right of individuals living with ALS, MND, and their caregivers to have access to genetic counseling and testing. We did a roundtable a couple of years ago, and we added that right to our fundamental rights document. It's really the foundation of all the work we do at the International Alliance. And while it's aspirational in nature, we know that not every country around the world has access to genetic counselors and genetic testing. We do aspire that everyone living with ALS MND has the right to that access, as close to diagnosis as possible, and that they also have the right to up-to-date education about clinical genetics in ALS MND and safeguards against genetic discrimination, which I'm sure will come up in our conversations today. And also within those fundamental rights, we believe that subject to education and counseling, blood relatives should also be given the same access where it's relevant and where people choose to avail themselves of that. So let me introduce our wonderful panel to you. We have hailing from Australia, Dr. Ashley Crook, who is a certified genetic counselor. She works at Macquarie University Center for MND Research and at Austin Health. Her PhD project focused on genetic counseling practice standards for ALS, MND, and FTD. We also have with us Lainey Drage, and she is a genetic counselor in adult neurology at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her clinical focus includes FTD spectrum disorders, ALS, and other neurodegenerative conditions. Her research interests include the lived experience of at-risk individuals, predictive genetic testing considerations, and genetic counseling access and service delivery. We also have with us Jean Swidler, who's a committed activist with experience bringing people together to make change in the campus, LGBT and labor movement, and she's committed to herself to transforming how those at risk of genetic ALS and FTD, and ultimately all adult onset neurological conditions are treated. The genetic ALS FTD community has historically had no voice in the care that is offered, or more routinely denied to them. And Jean and her community are changing that. Jean is the founding chair of Genetic ALS and FTD and The Legacy, the first organization dedicated solely to the needs of the genetic ALS and FTD community. And last, but certainly not least, is Jessica May. And she is the Alliance's program coordinator. In 2014, Jessica's mother was diagnosed with ALS, MND, bulbar onset, and she decided to return to Columbia early in 2015. And just to clarify, I mean Columbia, the country, not Columbia, the university, to help care for her mom alongside her father. Jessica's mother passed away in February 2018, and Jess now advocates for PALS and CALS globally. In her role as programs coordinator, she's responsible for the Alliance's programming, supports the member associations, advisory councils, and is involved in various projects that she believes are getting us closer to a world free of ALS, MND. So let's get started. I've given a brief introduction to our panelists, and now I would like to have each of them complement that a little. Ashley and Lainey, can you tell us briefly about your activities or projects as genetic counselors and why genetic counseling is so important? I'll start with Ashley, and then maybe Lainey, you could go next.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, look, so I've been working with people with ALS, MND and their families for at least the last 8 years, working in clinics to provide genetic counselling for them. And through that time, I guess I identified that there were a lot of different experiences for how genetic testing was undertaken, some positive and some negative. So that kind of led to me looking into doing some further research in this area. So I received a grant to do a 1-year project, which then led to an interest in doing a PhD project focused on genetic counselling and testing in ALS, MND. And part of that was developing a standard of practice. So I guess minimum requirements for genetic counselling for ALS, MND, particularly focused on the initial testing that's done in the family, known as diagnostic testing usually. And kind of all the considerations that should be made from a health clinician perspective. And it was really important to have the voice of the people with ALS, MND and their families as part of that, as well as people, health professionals and people who work with families as well. So I finished that last year and I'm back doing clinical work, which I'm really enjoying. And I'm soon to start a dementia project. So working with people newly diagnosed with dementia and providing genetic counselling and testing. And I firmly believe that genetic counselling is important, which is why I have dedicated my time over the last few years focusing on this area. So certainly looking forward to discussing it further over the next hour. On to you, Lainey.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks, Kathy and Jess, for inviting us to be part of this today. I think it speaks to the amount of value that you guys have placed on genetic counseling and testing that you've invited us to be part of this webinar. So thank you. So I've been the genetic counselor for the Penn FTD and Penn ALS centers for a little over 3 years now. And like Ashley, research has been part of my role over the last few years, as well as clinical care. And so for the ALS side, I'm very lucky to be the counselor who staffs our ALS clinic every week. And so it's I get the opportunity to meet with anybody who comes into clinic who has questions about genetics or wants some counseling about that. And so like Ashley was saying, I meet with people who are undergoing diagnostic evaluation, so people who already have a diagnosis of ALS and are looking to understand why. But I also have the opportunity to meet with people considering what we call predictive genetic testing, which is when they don't have any symptoms, but they're looking to see if they're at risk. And so those types of sessions can be very different. And I think one of the sort of key takeaways that I hope you'll get from listening to all of us share our experiences today is that just having a genetic counseling appointment does not mean you have to pursue any testing. And I think one of the things I've found in the last 3 years of being involved in this community is, sometimes the counseling itself is way more important than any test you could offer someone. So I've really enjoyed getting to be part of people's journeys and hearing, what the diagnosis process was like for them, or what it's been like to adjust to knowing this risk might be in their family. And so that has really shaped a lot of the research work that I'm working on now as well. And so I can't emphasize enough how important I think access to counseling and testing is, but also emphasizing that counseling doesn't always have to result in testing. So one of my many soapboxes that I'm sure we'll all get to stand on today.
And I think we would join you on that soapbox for sure. We believe strongly in counseling. And in fact, we're doing everything we can in our power to make sure we change the lexicon so that we always say genetic counseling and testing rather than genetic testing and counseling, because we believe counseling should precede testing so that people are supported in their journey towards understanding. So, and as you said, Lainey, it doesn't always have to result in testing. So the counseling, the emphasis on counseling is very important. So we'll jump right up on that soapbox with you. And I think now we'll turn to Jess and Jean to understand their backgrounds and their stories a little bit, and have them ask some questions of our genetic counselors that are very, as I said before, very real to them, and will have transferability to others in our community. Obviously, we understand that we're only looking at 2 scenarios today, and there are many different types of scenarios that could come up in genetic counseling. And so although you're answering Jess and Jean's questions, if you could maybe add on, what other scenarios might lead to as well as you give your answers, that would be great. So Jess, why don't you share your story with us, and then you can ask some questions of our 2 genetic counselors that are here.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm so excited to the next hour. I'm so looking forward to this discussion. So to add to what you have already mentioned, genetic testing or counseling was not something that was offered at the time here in Colombia. This has now slightly changed for testing, but unfortunately not for counseling. At the time, this would be 2014, 2015, we were not informed, offered, or even had the discussion. And I will clarify that this had nothing to do with the level of care we received at the time. It is just that genetic testing for ALS was not a service that was easily accessible here in Colombia. So I think it was simply just not discussed because of that. Genetic testing has only recently started being offered here in Colombia to those diagnosed, but there is not a process of ensuring or offering genetic counseling as a support. It is something that really the treating doctors handle in their own way. So my mom passed away with no genetic testing done on her, and to date, I haven't gotten tested. Also, being involved in the community, I am aware of its importance, but right now, as I don't feel I have access to proper counseling, I don't feel I'm ready to consider getting tested yet. So I guess this leads to my first question for Ashley, putting you on the spot, Ashley. When should genetic testing be done? And does it make a difference if your relative that had ALS has passed away before any testing?
Thanks, Jess. There's a lot to answer from that small question, but I'll do my best, and hopefully Lainey can jump in if I have missed something quite obvious. So I guess probably the first thing to mention is that genetic testing is not perfect. So it's not as simple as getting a yes, it's there, or no, it's not there answer. So we know that sometimes genetic testing can bring some uncertainty. So maybe we find a change that we don't understand yet. But we also know that even with families with absolutely very likely familial or inherited ALS, some families will not have a genetic change found using our current technology. So it's important to know those limitations and keep them in mind when we are thinking about genetic testing. And your question was around, well, there's kind of two parts to your question. I answer the second part now. So does it make a difference if your relative that had ALS has passed away? It does, yes and no. So particularly I'm noticing over the last few years, there's been a bit more of a trend of people being interested in genetic testing after, experiencing the death of a family member. And I think that's because we're starting to see that genetic testing and counselling is being more widely discussed and reported. And similar to you, Jess, you may not have ever been offered the option to consider testing at the time, because traditionally there was the thought that if there was just a single person in the family affected, then there was no suggestion genetic testing would be useful. I guess things are changing now where, I am finding I'm meeting quite a few people who are interested after the fact. And I guess what I talk to them about is the limitations of testing. So certainly testing is available. I've talked about the limitations already, but there's additional limitations when you are testing someone who does not have a diagnosis themselves. So if we tested you and we identified a genetic change, then that's a whole other thing, which I'm sure we'll have some time talking about the potential impacts of a positive result. But I guess the most likely outcome from testing you would be that we wouldn't find genetic answer to explain your family history of ALS MND. And that could either mean that there's something there that you don't have or that can't be found using current technology, or that there is nothing there. And if we were to test every member of your family, including your mother, when she was alive, then we would have not found anything. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not as clear cut an answer that we can get from genetic testing, which always leaves a little bit of uncertainty anyway. So you can do all the testing you like, but there will still be a little bit of uncertainty about the meaning of the result for you, unless we do find that you have a genetic change or genetic fault, which explains the family history. And in that case, we'd be talking about the impact for not only you, but other family members, and kind of talk about coping with that information as well. So there is a lot to process before even considering testing, which I'm sure we'll get into. I don't want to spend all my time talking, so I'll just answer quickly your second part, which is when should genetic testing be done? And the general message is that it should be offered early, and the key word is offered, not necessarily done. We know, I don't have to tell anyone in this audience how progressive this condition can be. And we also know that some people with ALS MND might develop some cognitive changes as well. So by offering it early, it provides the opportunity for time for consideration, and also perhaps more involvement of the person with ALS MND who's undergoing the testing. Hope that helps.
It has. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just before we move on to your next question, Jess, one of our pre-submitted questions ties in really well with what you and Ashley are chatting about. And one of the pre-submitted questions was, can DNA be banked from a relative who doesn't want to know the results, but their offspring can access it following their death?
Yes, great question, and absolutely yes. Certainly it would be a discussion with a genetic counsellor or similar health professional about how to do that. There's particular consent involved, and kind of clear understanding about the use of the DNA in the future. But it's certainly something that can be done, particularly knowing how overwhelming a time it can be for a family. Lainey, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick thing. In addition to DNA banking, it sounds like people are trying to think about, are there ways that we can access sample if a person's no longer with us, or preserve sample for the future? And so DNA banking is absolutely, one of those pathways. And I agree with everything Ashley was saying. And I just wanted to add that sometimes people, when they were living with ALS, might have participated in research studies that included collection of DNA in some way, shape, or form, whether through saliva or through blood. And so sometimes another way that people might be able to track down a sample for future testing is if their loved one participated in research. There's no guarantee sample would still be around, and every protocol has different rules and regulations in terms of whether you can access results, but that's another pathway that sometimes families find helpful.
Right. So I'll jump in for my next question for Lainey. So what needs to be considered for genetic testing? For example, I am part of a very, very, very large family, Lainey, like very large. My mom was one of 11. So I am very aware that the results affect more people than just me.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. And wow, what a large family tree. So, you know, I think there's different considerations for both diagnostic testing, where you're testing a person who has the diagnosis, and predictive testing, where you're testing someone who's looking to see about risk. So in your situation, Jess, you fall into that second category. And so there's a lot of emotional considerations for yourself that go into that, right? Do you really want to know if you have inherited risk or not? And how would you use that information in your life, if at all? You know, would you make different decisions about planning for your future in any way, shape, or form? How would you emotionally cope with that information? But then from a practical standpoint, it's really important to think about some protections that do and don't exist. And I can share my experience from the US. I recognize that's not the experience from everywhere throughout the world, but there's a law that says generally, you know, in most cases, your health insurance and your employer cannot ask for or use your genetic information against you in any way. There's some exceptions, like if you work for the military, the federal government, or a small company with less than 15 employees. But generally in the US, the law called GINA says that your health insurance and your employer can't use your genetic information to discriminate against you. But actually, the reason why we usually point that out is to point out loopholes, which are that life insurance, long-term care insurance, and disability insurances can ask for your personal and family medical information, including your genetics, and use that to deny you coverage or charge you a high premium. And so whenever people are thinking about predictive testing, we strongly encourage them to think about what insurances they have now and which ones they might want someday before putting any of this type of information in their medical chart. Because if you get those policies sorted out, once you have them in place, they can't be taken away. So some people will think about organizing that ahead of time, or they'll think about pursuing alternative pathways for getting genetic information, like going through a research study that might allow you to get results without it being part of your medical record. But to the other part of your question about, you know, could this impact other how will this impact other family members, excuse me, and like, what do I need to think about there? You know, it's really tricky. So your genetic result would not automatically reveal anything about your siblings' status, but it could tell us whether they have risk. So, you know, if we found that you had a genetic difference, we would assume that this very likely is one that your mother had as well. And then most often in genetic forms of ALS, we're talking about what we call an autosomal dominant inheritance pattern, where there's a 50% or 1 in 2 chance for each child of the person who's affected to inherit the same genetic difference. And so if we found you had a genetic cause and we assumed that your mother had it, then we'd be saying your siblings probably also have that 50% chance. And if you have children, the same thing would be true for them. So even though you wouldn't be automatically disclosing the status of other people in your family, you'd be informing them about potential risk. And so we really encourage people to have these conversations with their family members before they pursue testing and talk about, would you want to know my results if I got them? And how would you like me to communicate that with you? And that can be really tricky to navigate from family to family.
Thank you very much, Lainey. That was really valuable. Thanks.
Do you have anything else you want to add, Ashley, before we move on to the next part of the webinar?
No, I think you covered quite a lot, Lainey. I guess, yeah, as you flagged, the insurance implications are probably different wherever you are. So it'd be important to kind of seek information for where you are located. That's all I had to say. Thanks, Kathy.
Excellent. Thanks, Ashley. Now we're going to turn the microphone over to Jean to share her story and ask some questions of our genetic counselors. Jean, take it away.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here and for the women on this call who have dedicated their careers and their lives to bettering the circumstance of people impacted by ALS and FTD and their families. So just wanted to say that my family, knew we had inherited ALS. My great-grandfather died of ALS in 1970. My grandmother died of ALS in 1990. She had two brothers that probably had FTD that died in their early 90s. My mother was very anxious about developing ALS after my grandmother died, and would talk about it all the time, and did not have any resources for her to do that. Also, my aunt just died from ALS. My mom was the oldest child of 7 that made it to adulthood, and my aunt was the youngest. So now there's 5 siblings in between who I don't believe have pursued genetic testing, but of course know they're at risk. So we have decided to get together to make sure that there's better resources and better options for us. Like my mom lived in the suburbs of New York City and tried to get diagnosed with severe disabilities in 2017 and mentioned her family history, but a local ALS specific neurologist did not do anything for that, just said, oh, well, you got nerve damage, did not order genetic testing, made her wait to get much even further progressed before she found out that she had the mutation. And I did also find out that I carry the mutation. So just wanted to give that brief introduction. Thank you. And I did have a question for our genetic counselors. You guys are great. Thank you so much. I know it comes up a lot that people ask, well, I've got this mutation you told me, so what do I do about it? What can I do? So what do you guys tell them?
Thanks, Jean. That's thanks for sharing your story as well. And that question is something that does come up, and it's really tricky. And I'd also be interested to know what you think as well. Usually what I say is, honestly, we just don't know if there is anything you can do. And that's the honest answer. So we know that almost all of these kind of genes, there are different kind of susceptibilities. So it's not always 100% that you are likely to develop disease, but we don't understand what the potential triggers are clearly enough just yet, and ways to kind of control that, which is quite different to other areas of practice where we work to an extent. So I guess with that in mind, Jean, what would you suggest that we say?
Well, I think it should be acknowledged that there are disease-modifying therapies in ALS for the last 30 years. Since 1995, Riluzole was approved, and yet somehow we've got into 2023 without it ever having been contemplated in the literature when would be the good time to initiate that therapy in those at risk. And that is kind of mind-boggling. There also currently the current diagnostic standards say that there should be no difference between people with a family history or a gene mutation and those without. And if you're aware of the diagnostic standards, they talk about weakness in multiple body areas. So we are currently in a pickle where, like my mom had multiple areas and still couldn't get genetic testing, but or a diagnosis, but where people develop weakness, clinical weakness, and are told to wait for it to spread. And so that just doesn't make sense to us. So we are trying to get the field to consider what should be done in these situations. And we have a great response from many people. And our someone we work closely with, Dr. Terry Hyman Patterson, is working on a first ever workshop to talk about what to do about people in this position. So we're very pleased with that later this year. But folks should talk to their doctor and look at what's around and think about healthy lifestyle choices. Of course, there's many things that might be beneficial that are not necessarily proven to do anything for this particular case, but there's no harm in living a healthy lifestyle for sure. Just some brief thoughts.
Yeah, and I can add some thoughts also. So glad that you guys are both bringing up all of these really important points. And I think that another thing that's come up for me in counseling families is the so what can I do, sometimes feels different to different people, right? So for some people, it's only the, well, what can I do to prevent? What can I do to treat? What can I do to cure? And for others, it's what can I do with this information to make changes to my life in other ways? Obviously, not saying that prevention isn't still on their minds, but knowing that there isn't a proven preventative right now, what else can we do? And so I think it's also important to help walk people through how they feel this changes their lives in other ways. So for example, some people might make different decisions about their family planning. Some people make different decisions about how they think about what they want to do with their career or retirement plans or other financial planning. Sometimes people think about, what does family communication look like from here, and how can I get support? What resources can I connect to? Things like the International Alliance, but other local and national supports as well. Groups like the one that Jean has founded, and also there's tools in the community to connect one-on-one with others on the same journey. So I think, in addition to what Ashley and Jean have highlighted, I also think when people say, what's the so what, there's more to it than just the medical aspect. And Gina, also, I really appreciate you bringing up talking to the physician. I think a lot of people find value in having a baseline neurologic exam and establishing care with someone they trust, so that if symptoms pop up that they're worried about or they're nervous, they can always go to their point of contact. But it's really important for people to think about those insurance considerations before meeting, with a neurologist or talking to their primary care doc, and having that become part of their medical chart.
I had one other question that I wanted to make sure to pose to our wonderful counselors. So, and if my family or myself tested a while ago, do I need to get retested?
I can start us off for this one. So the answer sort of depends on the situation. So if there's a person who was diagnosed with ALS and had testing and an informative genetic finding wasn't found, a causal finding wasn't identified, then repeated testing can be really valuable, especially if it was prior to 2011, because the most common genetic cause of ALS, the C9orf72 repeat expansion, wasn't even actually identified until just over 10 years ago. And so just like that gene has been discovered as a cause, many more genes are discovered over time. So if the family underwent testing and no cause was found, repeating testing over time can be appropriate. But if there's a family where there was a known genetic cause of the condition found, and someone got tested to see their risk status, so like Jean, you mentioned how you've had testing to learn your risk status, it's not like repeated testing needs to be done to see if your own result would change. We wouldn't expect your DNA code to change over time. You either have inherited that genetic difference in the family or you haven't. So there's different scenarios when repeat testing is or isn't indicated, and speaking with a genetic counselor or a clinician with expertise in genetics is really important to help guide that process. But I think it's an excellent question, and it's one that comes up all the time. Ashley, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Oh, I completely agree. And you've kind of thought about all the potentials of each result. So that sounds good. Thanks, Lainey.
Jean, any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, I'm also just realizing too with this is that not just to find out if before there was no hit and now there's a hit, like my mom only got tested for C9. When I was tested, I was only tested for C9. And, there are people with multiple mutations, and there's also, risk genes that are interesting that, making sure to check back about if you had a panel done or not might also be something to consider. Just wanted to say, and that was my last question. Thank you so much.
That's a great addition. Thanks, Jean. So Ashley and Lainey, we've heard from two different individuals in two very different situations in terms of genetic counseling and testing. And what are some other common scenarios that you see in your day-to-day work that you do with this community that we should be aware of, and some common questions that come up from them? Lainey, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding this question right. So when you're talking about the scenarios, you're talking about a person who has a loved one with ALS who has passed and no testing was performed. And then we've got a person who's part of a family with a known genetic cause. So are you thinking about other scenarios like that sort of high level?
Exactly. And also, I think probably we could talk about the lexicon at this point in the discussion, because I've been very careful not to use the word sporadic or familial or any other singleton or any other words that would classify certain scenarios. So if you could talk about that a little bit, that would be great.
Sure. So, yeah, we'll get another soapbox to stand on here. So a lot of times people talk about familial versus sporadic and use that to say, you know, who should have access to testing, or traditionally that's who it was offered to. But in the ALS world, we have really, as a field, moved towards the belief that every person with ALS, regardless of family history, should be offered the opportunity to have counseling and testing if they want it. And so part of the reason for that is even though it is a much higher likelihood of finding a genetic cause if there is a known family history of ALS or related conditions like frontotemporal degeneration or Parkinson's disease, there are still some people with no known family history of ALS who still have a genetic form. And so part of the reason for that is that sometimes a genetic difference will occur brand new in a person. And so even though there's no known family history, they can still have a genetic cause that occurred when the sperm and egg that created them came together. And part of the reason is because family history is not a perfect tool. You know, there are people who have a genetic form of ALS where maybe nobody else in the family appeared to have you know, ALS or related conditions because everyone passed away young of other causes like heart disease or cancer. Or maybe people didn't make it to the right physicians or ever end up with the right diagnosis. You heard Jean talking about how hard it can be to get the diagnosis sometimes. And in FTD, it's extremely challenging to get the right diagnosis. And so that's the other thing. People might have had family history of dementia and not put the connection together that the dementia and ALS could be related. Or sometimes families don't always communicate well. There could be estrangement, or it could be a really small family. So it could look like, you know, nobody developed symptoms, but there weren't that many people in the family to begin with. So because of that, we feel it's really important to offer counseling and testing to anybody who's been diagnosed with ALS. And really that term sporadic, I personally don't enjoy. I think it's really apparent sporadic because there's always going to be someone in the family who's first. It doesn't mean that somebody else in the family couldn't go on to develop symptoms later, and we shouldn't use that to screen out people from accessing counseling and testing.
Thank you so much. That your answer relates to about 5 of the questions that I have to ask in the limited time that we have left. Ashley, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess I was going to flag, certainly this isn't available everywhere, but sometimes people do use information from genetic testing to consider reproductive decision-making. And although that hasn't been the focus today, I think it's always worth flagging. And obviously access is different in different areas, but I know there was a question that came through the Q&A about that as well. So for anyone with a known kind of genetic mutation or genetic fault in the family, there are options to consider when thinking about children, and there's no right or wrong. So the first option is doing nothing and knowing that your children may be at risk, and that in ALS-MND testing is available for them as adults. Some people might consider going through the IVF process and selecting embryos that do not have the genetic fault, knowing that it won't be passed on to future generations. And there's also options through pregnancy, so testing a pregnancy and then consider stopping a pregnancy if the genetic change is there. Sometimes we talk to people about a range of different options, including choosing not to have children, using donor sperm, egg or embryo, adoption. And the other thing to flag is for some people with kind of adult onset diseases, kind of similar to this, who are at risk of having an underlying genetic change, sometimes people don't want to know their own result, but want to consider reproductive decision making. And there are actually options through that called exclusion testing, which can be done by not actually knowing your own genetic status. So it's very broad, what I've just discussed, and it's probably very individual as well in terms of decisions and locations and access. But I did want to flag that that was an important consideration, because obviously people like to use sometimes this information for family planning purposes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Lainey, as well for your prior answer. So as I said, Lainey, you touched on a whole bunch of questions that have been pre-submitted and that we had designed for the webinar as well. But the first one that you brought up was looking at the family history and looking at other things broader than dementia. So for example, one of the things I didn't say in my introduction is that I have the exact same scenario as Jessica. I am the daughter of someone who passed from ALS, who did not have access to genetic counseling and testing. And at the time that my mom was ill with ALS, a very common phrase that we heard was ALS only impacts the body, it doesn't impact the mind. And so that was 20 years ago. And now, of course, we know that there is a strong relationship between ALS and FTD. So how valid is the family history if clinicians are or specialists are only being asking about ALS alone, and how should we see that change in the future?
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story and highlighting this really important point. I think now we know that, you know, almost half of all people with ALS will have some form of cognitive difficulty as part of that, whether it's a full out diagnosis of FTD or just some other mild cognitive impairment. And so, you know, it's hard to break that, you know, stereotype that had been built about this condition for so many years. But it's important that we recognize it. And to your point about family history, we can't just ask about ALS. You're going to miss so many people that have suggestive family histories. You know, like I said before, regardless, we think counseling and testing should be offered to all people with ALS, regardless of the family history. So hopefully that helps, and that push in the field helps, you know, circumvent this problem. But I think it can give us clues and help people better anticipate what is the likelihood that we're going to find something if we do this testing, and that can help people prepare to learn the results. So, you know, when I see somebody in clinic who has ALS and they come to me and say, oh, you know, I'm not really worried about a genetic cause because nobody else in the family tree had ALS. But then you start asking more questions, and maybe nobody had a formal diagnosis of something like FTD, but there was somebody that, you know, had some behavior changes. They started acting oddly compared to their previous selves. They might have, you know, eventually ended up with a diagnosis of just dementia from like a primary care doc and never went to get it a more specific diagnosis. And if we start to see more people like that popping up in the family tree, I can advise them about, you know, what is FTD and help them prepare to understand that sometimes there is a link between ALS and these cognitive conditions. So I think not only is it helpful in figuring out what are the odds that we might find something, but also helping somebody then get educated and prepared, and you're not hit with it all at once when we do find a result that might explain all of these different pieces in the family tree.
Jean, you mentioned when you were telling your story that you had a couple of uncles, I think you said, that had possibly passed with FTD. So do you have a comment on the family history piece as well before we turn it over to Ashley?
Yeah, they were my mother's uncles, so my great uncles. And you know, how it came out in the pedigree that was done at Columbia University by Ellie Harrington with my mom was that they went crazy later in life, and there was public nudity stuff happening, and things that, you know, when you read about FTD, it tracks. But I just wanted to add one other note. You know, FTD, I think, and Lainey stopped me, wasn't a term that was really used very often until the last number of years. So really, you're looking at any dementia. And even if you look up FTD now, you know, it'll often say memory is spared. But in C9orf72, the most common genetic cause of ALS and FTD, apparently, you know, memory issues are often a presenting symptom of FTD. And so certainly in the past, people would have had an Alzheimer's diagnosis with memory issues. So certainly wise to be expansive about the things that are looked at. And my grandmother was said to have Parkinson's first, you know, before she developed, you know, the progressive weakness of ALS. And yeah, so same thing for Parkinson's too, especially with C9. So just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Jean. Ashley, did you want to comment on this?
No, I think Lainey and Jean have absolutely said anything I would say.
So let's look to the future now then. Can we talk a little bit about the fact that genetics is constantly evolving? Obviously, it's a field that's only a couple of decades old. I think we just passed the 30th anniversary of the first discovery, but can you comment on upcoming research and what we're hoping to learn?
I can go first on this one. So I think that it's a really exciting time for ALS and FTD research. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done, but I think one of the main reasons that we have seen this push for offering counseling and testing to all people diagnosed is because there are gene-specific trials and treatments happening now and on the horizon. And so, as this community knows all too well, the earlier the better because of the progression, like, Ashley was talking about before. And so the sooner we can offer counseling and testing to people, the better we can intervene when we have these trials and treatments. And so we need to create a trial-ready, a treatment-ready population, or at least give the people the opportunity to put themselves in a position where they can be ready for this. We're in a time where not only are there trials for people diagnosed with a condition, but also for some genetic forms, there are trials for people who know they have a difference in a gene, but don't have any symptoms yet. And so I think there's a lot of excitement to see where these drugs that are in trials now will go, with some other drugs already on the table for FDA review. And it's amazing to think how far we've come, but also still very respectfully acknowledge that there's still a long way to go. So I think we will see more gene-targeted therapies coming down the pipeline. And the hope is that what we learn from these therapies targeting etiologies that we understand a little bit more of the biology, we can take that and apply it to people who don't even have a known genetic form. So we're hoping that this can help the full community.
Ashley, anything to add?
No, I agree. It is an exciting time, and I'm excited to see even where the next 5 or 10 years are going in this area.
And I have, if you could just keep your mic open there, Ashley, we do have a pre-submitted question, and I guarantee I'm going to get this wrong. So I will just read it exactly as it's written. Is there any research being conducted in SETX, C233A, CP, LYS, HETROCIGOSIS, VUS mutation in ALS?
Sure. So that's a question about whether there is any research on a specific genetic change in the SETX gene. So I assume that the person who submitted this question may have had this found as part of their testing. I guess the clue that comes to me is there's a VUS. So that stands for variant of uncertain significance. And as I briefly mentioned before, there's kind of 3 types of genetic testing results: one where it's positive, one where nothing's been identified, and another where we find a change, we don't know exactly what it means. I have not come across this variant before in part of my practice, so I can't comment too much. Sometimes the laboratories that conduct the testing might have avenues for opportunities for further research. Did you know any particular group, Lainey, that focus on the SETX gene?
Yeah, I was just trying to think. I don't know of any group in particular focusing on this gene. I haven't heard of any trials specifically targeted to this gene, but what I would recommend, in addition to reaching out to the laboratory, which I think is so important, or having your clinician do that on your behalf, there are some large observational research studies focused on ALS generally or FTD generally. And so sometimes reaching out to key researchers on those observational studies can be helpful, and they might be able to share if they've seen others in their cohorts with the same or similar variants. And to find research, the best sort of location to go is clinicaltrials.gov for the US. That actually has international studies there as well. It's a little bit clunky of a website, to put it nicely. And so yeah, a clinician can help you with that as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And my next question, I'm going to blend a couple of questions together. We have a question in the Q&A and also a pre-submitted question about if genetic testing isn't offered, what should someone tell their neurologist or their healthcare profession so that they can get access to it? And the question in the Q&A is, what if I don't want to go through my healthcare professional? Is there another way to get access to genetic counseling and testing? So in both of those situations, the person wants to have access to genetic counseling and testing. What's the best way to get to that?
I can speak locally just from Australia, but I think Lainey's probably got a bit more of a US perspective. So most genetic counselling and testing in Australia occurs through genetics clinics. So they are usually public clinics around Australia. There are also some specific clinics. So for example, where I work at Macquarie University MND Clinic and Research Centre, there's a private genetic counsellor who could go through bypass, I guess, going through your standard health professional that way. Lainey?
Sure. So in the US, not every ALS clinic has a genetic counselor embedded into it. I think our site at Penn is actually one of a few that has a genetic counselor like fully dedicated to the clinic. But many neurologists, even if they don't have a clinic, a genetic counselor embedded in their clinic, would be able to refer you to a genetic counselor either in the institution or locally. And there's also, COVID has helped. One silver lining of the pandemic is that there's a lot of telehealth genetic counseling resources now too available in the US, either through individual institutions or through telehealth genetic counseling companies that are fully remote. And so there's a wonderful tool called Find a Genetic Counselor. If you Google Find a Genetic Counselor, you'll see something from the National Society of Genetic Counselors where you can plug in the US, your state or your zip code, and it'll tell you counselors nearby. So if your clinician, like your neurologist, your primary care doc, doesn't know a genetic counselor they typically work with, you can find one using that tool and reach out. There are also some sponsored counseling and testing programs that exist in the US where testing companies will partner with pharmaceutical companies to offer no-cost counseling and testing. Not all of them offer counseling, and I would discourage you from having the testing without the counseling. But that's something to look into as well. And then I know I've harped on this a little bit, but the research side is also sometimes another avenue where you can access the counseling and testing without going through a healthcare provider in the clinic, where it can be sort of documented outside of your medical chart per whatever the study protocol is. But that's not going to be available at all locations. And there's sort of different inclusion and exclusion criteria for research studies. So that might not always be an option, but it's something you can look into.
Jess, would you like to just make a comment about what we aspire to in terms of telehealth and genetic counseling worldwide?
Yes, so we've actually had a conversation with Lainey about it also. We're starting to sort of take steps to see how to move forward with having like some sort of global universal helpline or telehealth support to be able to provide access on genetic counseling to those areas and regions that don't have it right now. So it is something we're constantly talking about. So watch this space.
Thanks, Jess. And I know we only have about 7 minutes left, but I do want to raise a question that came in through the Q&A, and again, also one that we had pre-submitted. I want to move over into kind of the mental health area, the psychosocial support that you provide as genetic counselors. And you must have people that you work with that perhaps aren't ready to hear the news. And also one of the questions that we had that Jess raised in our pre-submits was, will I be worse off mentally after receiving the test results? So Jess, do you want to add anything to that question?
So yes, the one was about sort of the after effect of receiving those. And and I ask is I think this also applies to other people that are in a similar situation as I am, is it wrong that getting tested is not important at this stage? It might change in the future, but is it okay not knowing? Do I need to feel guilty about it? Just wanted to sort of test the waters about what's right and what's wrong, if that's the right way to say it. Mhm.
I can go first if you like, and then I'm sure Lainey can fill in some of the gaps, because you've touched on a really important area and something that I guess we as genetic counsellors really think is important to think about before going ahead with testing, particularly if you're someone who does not have any symptoms of the condition. And obviously you can't unknow this information. So that's important to know. So Jess, it's absolutely not wrong to not feel sure about wanting to have genetic testing. And in fact, in my experience, I would say when we look at families, more people decide not to find out than do at this point in time. And there's a lot to consider. And, when we're thinking about the, psychological impacts, mental health impacts, it can be a huge thing. There's so much to jump into on this point, so I'm just trying to gather my thoughts for the next 4 minutes. So I guess part of the pre-test counselling, when we are talking to people about the decision, is really exploring the potential impacts of receiving results, all possible results, the impacts on them, the impacts on other family members as well, how they might react to the result, what their sources of support are, whether they had any access to psychological or mental health support, whether that should be considered, whether they should bring a support person with them as part of the discussion, knowing that the time frame for testing isn't immediate, that it can take, sometimes a few months, and that can have a big impact on people. So really putting it out there, that there is a lot to consider as part of this, and really supporting people through a timeline that works for them, and knowing that, as Lainey has really emphasised, that people can come for genetic counselling without ever proceeding with testing. And from my point of view as a genetic counsellor, I find that a really successful session, really, knowing that you've added some value to how people think about their risk and everything. Some people believe that they would be better off mentally after receiving results as well. So certainly this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone sees testing as a big decision or big burden. So it's always worth kind of knowing that everyone's an individual, and everyone's different, whoever we meet and sit and talk with. Lainey, did you have anything to add?
That was beautifully said, Ashley. I think that you hit all of the main things I was thinking about. Really, genetic counselors feel like we've accomplished our goals if we're helping somebody make the decision that's best for them, right? We will never come into it saying, oh, they really should have tested, or they really shouldn't have. It's how can we support you in making the decision that's right for you in this moment? And to Ashley's point, the timing is really important too. Like you could say no for now, and something may change in the future, whether there's a treatment that gets approved, or there's this decision that you would use this information for in your life. And so you can always access genetic counseling over time, and making the decision to not know your results now doesn't mean that you have to stick to that forever, right? The counselor is always there to help support you through that process over time. And, in terms of the, is it wrong to not want to know? I think this all speaks to that answer, and that it's highly personal and it's so individual. And, I think it's one of the key things to keep in mind is that we're really bad at humans as predicting how we're going to react to something. There's literally cognitive psychology research out there that proves it. And so regardless of how results come back, it can be emotionally a bit of a roller coaster, and that's okay. And that's normal. And as long as you are in a place where you feel ready to take that on, then genetic counselors are there to support you through that.
Thank you, Lainey.
Thank you.
We only have 1 minute left. So 15 seconds each, a final thought. And I'll turn to Ashley first, and then the rest of you have 15 seconds as well.
I don't even know what to say. I feel like it's been a really great discussion and great to have input from different people, and certainly encourage anyone to reach out if they need to.
Thank you, Ashley. Lainey?
Yeah, also thank you so much for this opportunity. And like Ashley said, I feel like this is just like touching the surface of all of these major topics. And so if any of these things sound like discussions that you want to have, please reach out to a genetic counselor. Like we said, it doesn't mean you have to do testing. So if there's anything that came up today that made you curious or want to learn more, just request a genetic counseling visit. And I'm sure there'll be resources shared after this webinar. I'm happy to provide contact information. So thank you all to the panelists and to the Alliance for hosting this.
Thank you. Jean, 15 seconds.
Yes, thank you all so much for all your great input, all the great questions, and you know, there's going to be a lot coming in this space. So please stay engaged. Thank you so much.
Jess?
Well, I'll add the thank yous and watch the space with the Alliance. We're really focusing on genetic counseling and testing. So, you know, it's the first of many sessions, and thank you to the panel. It's been fantastic.
And I will add my thanks in my 15 seconds and also mention that we have genetic counseling and testing resources on our website available to you. We have some infographics, and if you want more background on what does ALS MND genetics mean and some of those more complicated terms that Ashley and Lainey use in regular conversation, but the rest of us don't, you can look those up in our resources on our website, and Jesse has just posted those in the chat. So a huge thank you to Jean and Jess for sharing their stories, and also to Ashley and Lainey for their very empathetic presentations on what they deal with day to day. I wish we could clone you and spread you worldwide so that everyone should have access to such fantastic resources on a day-to-day basis. And thanks once again to our supporter Biogen for making this webinar series possible. I wish everyone a great day, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.